big welcome for Bjarte.
Thank you. I hope you do that afterwards as well, when I'm finished. It's wonderful to see all of you here coming from many different places in Europe. I would like to say a special welcome to all our friends from Iceland. I mean, in case you counted, we've got 9 people from Iceland here. Wow. A small country of 330,000 people. So something is brewing in Iceland. And I'm not meaning the volcanoes. Some of you will have heard what I will talk about before. My apologies for that, but most of you, I think, will not have heard it, and you are my main topic, so my apologies for the rest of you. And in order to get through this on time, I will apply the same tactics as Julian did. I will talk loud and fast. But I will try to pose some questions as well. When I joined Statoil, I'll come back to the company in a minute, that was back in the early 80s. It was a smaller company than what it is today. And most small companies, they want to grow. They want to become big. And many succeed in becoming big. But they discover that we have not only become big, we have become bureaucratic. We have become, we lost a lot of the flexibility, agility we had as a small organization. In some cases, we have become sad places to work. And there's actually a kind of a parallel here to the aging process of man. Because as we grow older, we do lose a bit of the agility, flexibility we had as teenagers. I have passed 50, so I have some personal experience here. And when it comes to man, we have no choice. I mean, this is the way it goes, whether we like it or not. But when it comes to organizations, they have a choice, because it's written nowhere that because we are big, we should be slow, inflexible, and sad places to work. So a big issue for us has been, how can we find our way back to what we had as a smaller organization without losing the benefits of being big? So don't misunderstand me. There are many benefits of being big. So how can we be small and big at the same time? I think it's the big issue for big organizations. I think the question for small organizations is, if they want to grow, avoid kind of adopting all the stupid things that the big company seems to do, of all kind of management processes that will take you to the wrong places. What I would like to share with you today is first a little bit around problems with traditional management. There are many ways of kind of positioning this. I'd like us to, and we have talked about problems earlier, I'd like us to talk a little bit more, because if we don't kind of agree on what these problems are, it is harder to kind of find the way out of the misery. Few slides on beyond budgeting, but not much, because Anders covered a lot of this. I will spend most of the time talking about how we are trying to do this stuff in Statoil. And I'm saying trying because we started out in 2005, and everything I will talk about is decided. It is written into what we call the Statoil book. So that's not the issue. But I would not stand here and argue that we are kind of a perfect, fantastic, that all of this has reached every head and every corner of Statoil. That is not the case. We still have skeptics. We still have people to long back to the old comfortable model. We still make mistakes. We still stumble. We still have detours. And we still have setbacks. But this is what real change is about. Real change is never a straight line from A to B. Real change is actually quite messy, and it is never a quick fix. So if you don't have challenges and problems, then you are not into real change. I'm going to make the commercial here very, very short. This is Statoil in a nutshell, a Norwegian oil and gas company with significant international activities listed in New York and Oslo, and some data on the company. But let's not spend more time on Statoil. Let's move to some problems. And I'm going to be a bit philosophical around problems, but I want to start out with being a bit concrete and specific. And Anders was showing a list of problems earlier, and these are just other words on the same problems. And I have met very few managers over the last 15, 20 years disagreeing that these are problems with the budgeting process. So the big majority agrees these are problems. At the same time, the majority of problems continue to budget. I find that a bit fascinating. I've been thinking a lot about it, and I think there can only be two answers. I mean, one reason can be that, well, we know it's a flawed process, but we don't know what we should do instead. What's the alternative? Well, this is where beyond budgeting is coming in, because this beyond budgeting represents an alternative. But it could also be that people or managers say that, well, yes, we know about these problems, but they are not big enough to justify any big change. These are more kind of irritating itches, but not the symptoms of any serious disease. I would disagree. I would argue that these are much more than irritating itches. And the big disease here is about the fact that this process that was meant to support and enhance performance in organizations actually is doing the opposite. And if that is the case, that this is more of a barrier than a support for good performance, we have a serious problem. So performance here is for me a key word. So I would like us to reflect a little bit on performance for a few minutes, but in a slightly different setting than business. I would like us to move into traffic, because in traffic we would also like to see good performance when we are driving to work in the morning. And how would we define good performance in traffic? What does good performance in traffic look like? Anyone? Flow, a good flow, right? And a safe flow. So a safe and good flow of traffic is a definition of good performance in traffic. And traffic authorities are also trying to do this stuff, performance management, in order to make that happen. And what we often meet in traffic crossings put up by the traffic authorities to achieve a safe and good flow is the traffic light. 2 questions. Who is actually managing here, and based on which information? Who is managing here?
Depends. Is it automated?
By the way, this is the old-fashioned, there's no high-tech, there's no sensors, no nothing. So who is managing?
That is timer.
Well, and somebody programmed that time, right? So the guy programming this light, that is the one managing. Which information would that management be based on? History, some historical trends, maybe some forecast about the future, but there's just standing there waiting for that green light. Would this be entirely fresh information? No, it wouldn't, right, for obvious reasons. Now, this is one way of managing, with a good purpose, but with some weaknesses. Is there an alternative to the traffic light? The roundabout. Same questions, very different answers. Who is managing? The drivers, we. And based on which information? Current information. What we see here right now, real-time information. So since we arrive at so very different answers, could be interesting to compare a bit these two ways of managing. First of all, which of these two is normally most efficient? It's the roundabout. It's actually been proven that the roundabout is more efficient. And maybe it has something to do with what we just talked about. Information, access to fresh information. Well, of course, I mean, you have access to fresh information here as well. You can see what's happening. But what is it that you don't have that you have in the roundabout?
The control.
You have the authority to act on that information, right? I would argue that there is one more thing that needs to be in place for this to be more efficient. I'll come back to that in a minute. Which of these two is most difficult to drive in? It's the roundabout. And I would argue that everything we are trying to leave behind in Statoil is, from a leadership point of view, in a way much easier than what we are trying to do instead. That's why we have resistance, because some long back to what was easier. We are trying to simplify our processes from a management point of view, but from a leadership point of view, it is more difficult, more challenging. But leadership is not meant to be easy. Last but not least, before we leave traffic, is it relevant to talk about values in this setting of traffic? We often talk about values-based management, and the opposite of values-based management is rules-based management. And the traffic light is one example of a very simple rules-based management model. Red is stop and green is drive, then we can always discuss yellow. And if there is a mindset among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest. Normally not a big problem here, overruled by that red light. In the roundabout, that mindset is actually a big problem, because in the roundabout we are much more dependent on having this positive common purpose of wanting this to flow well. Here we have to be more considerate. We have to interpret each other's intentions. We have to interact with people in a very different way than what is needed here. So it's not enough with fresh information authority to act. You also need that positive value set. And again, managing performance, well, that is what authorities are doing here. This is more about creating conditions for great performance to take place. Big, big difference. What you see on the right-hand side is a more self-regulating management model than what you have on the left-hand side. And I would argue that in today's realities, we need more self-regulating management models, and we need it for at least 2 reasons. The first reason has to do with the world out there, which has a lot more of today of what they call, in the military, call VUCA. You might have heard that expression, V-U-C-A, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And if we take that VUCA seriously, it has significant implications for how we design our management models. The other reality we need to take seriously is not external, it's internal, has to do with people, and asking ourselves what kind of people do we have in our organization. And the language we chose for that discussion was Theory X and Theory Y, introduced by Douglas McGregor back in 1960, 2 opposing views about what motivates and drives people. Theory X, very much the negative people view, a view that most people in an organization is a bunch of potential thieves and crooks, which all must be managed tightly, and if we don't do that, we know what will happen. They will all run away, do a lot of stupid things, and spend money like drunken sailors. Well, that's the popular version. McGregor, he was a bit more academic and polite, but I think that's what he meant. I think so. Then you have Theory Y, very much the opposite view, a view that most people in an organization is, beyond being, well-educated, competent, are actually responsible, as Anders talked about earlier, actually responsible people who want to do a good job, want to perform, want to be involved, want to be listened to, want to be treated as adults. And again, without so far having a view on what is right, X or Y, I do have, but independent of that, your choice must must have implications for how you design your management models. If we combine these 2 realities we need to take seriously, then it might look like this, and you recognize the 2 dimensions. And I would argue that traditional management is in this lower left-hand corner, consciously or unconsciously. Before I define traditional management, a few more words on X and Y, because this is not about being naive. Every time I talk about X and Y, there are some faces popping up in my head. I can see those guys right now. Those faces belong to colleagues of mine at Statoil that I definitely would put on this side. I think you need to keep a close eye on those guys. There might be some faces popping up in your heads as well now, I don't know. But my point is that those people typically exist in any organization. That's not the issue. The issue is, do they constitute a minority or a majority? Because if they exist, like they do in Statoil, but if they constitute a minority, then we cannot base the design of our management models on minorities. Then we need to start with our majority view. If we believe that is here, we need to start with this view. And then we need to find other ways of dealing with these guys. It's just like in a free society. We are not putting everybody in jail because someone someday will do something wrong or has done something wrong, right? We are all free citizens within certain boundaries. Now, in order to get out of this, we need to address both leadership and management processes. And what we need to get out of is something that's very rigid, detailed, annual, very rules-based, and all the stuff that you've heard a lot about today. I recall when I made this slide, then I said to myself that, Bjarte, now you're being a bit too hard on traditional management. Don't overdo it. But I've been sharing this slide with so many events over so many years, and I've seen so many nodding faces that I don't think I was too hard on traditional management. There might have been a time when this was the right place to be. I'm not arguing that. There might still be places around where this is the right place to be. But for us in Statoil, that is a completely uninteresting discussion, because we know that our business environment is up there and not down here. And we believe that most people are here, which means that we can't be here. We need to move up in that upper right-hand corner by addressing both dimensions. And the way out of that goes, on the leadership side, it goes from being rules-based to more values-based. That doesn't mean no rules. It generally means that the more values-based you are, the less rules you typically need. We need more autonomy. In this world, there isn't always time to run 9 floors up to get that decision. Then it might be too late. And also, it isn't always that decisions become better because they are moved up to the 9th floor. We need more transparency. And this is good news for all those managers who are so afraid of leaving this comfortable corner because they are afraid of losing control. And I can understand that fear. That fear is real. Although a lot of the control they are afraid of losing is nothing but an illusion of control. But here is some good news. Transparency can be a great control mechanism, a social control mechanism. There is a reason why thieves and crooks operate at night. right? Because then it's dark. There is no transparency. You might have heard this wonderful story from a Swiss pharmaceutical company called Roche. Quite big, probably, I think so, traditionally managed, but they did a very interesting experiment recently within travel cost. We can all relate to travel cost, right? On travel costs, in a pilot, they kicked out the budget, they kicked out most travel rules and regulations. What they implemented instead, full transparency. So with a few exceptions, everybody could see everything. If you traveled, to where? Did you fly, eat, and sleep, cheap or expensive? Open for your colleagues to see and vice versa. What do you think happened with travel cost in that pilot versus travel cost in the rest of the company? That will be one of my many leading questions in this session here. Yes. So I hope we agree. A very simple self-regulating control mechanism. This was about tearing out pages in that rules book instead of adding even more pages. Last but not least, we must get hold of that intrinsic motivation in people that can move mountains if you can get hold of it. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff practiced in organizations to motivate falls in the category of extrinsic motivation. And I leave it for yourself to reflect on individual bonuses as a motivation mechanism and where that falls. I could have spent the 2 next hours talking about individual bonuses. Let me just make it very short. It is not only budgets I have lost my belief in when it comes to the ways of managing. Now, at Statoil, we have always tried to be a values-based, people-oriented organization since we hit the ground running in Norway in 1972. And by the way, that was just when Handelsbanken started their beyond budgeting journey. That was the point when we were born as a company. So our challenge, I'm not saying that we are perfect here, by no means, but maybe our biggest challenge was that we had management processes that had a different message. And it doesn't help to have these theory Y leadership visions if you have theory X management processes. So a lot of our journey has been about doing things on the process side to reflect not just a VUCA environment, but also a people view kind of based on or processes based on this kind of people view. And here are some examples of what you typically need to do. Yes, you typically need to do something with the budgeting process because that's in a way represents so much of what is down here. But again, I have been in organizations with budgets that are more beyond budgeting than other companies which technically have kicked out the budgets, but they have just found other ways of doing these things. So let's not fool ourselves. This is not just about budgets, right? We need to think differently around how we set goals and targets. We need less of what I call 29.2 targets in a dynamic world with these kind of people on board. We need to think more relative. We need to think more around values. How did we achieve those results? When we shall evaluate performance, we need to take into account hindsight insights, all the things we know afterwards that we didn't know up front. We call this a holistic performance evaluation. And last but not least, we need more dynamics into our processes. We need to organize the stuff we do based on rhythms of the business more than rhythms of the calendar, because January to December is generally an artificial construct from a business point of view. Not from an accounting point of view, not from a tax point of view, but that's not the stuff we are talking about here. And for me, this is what beyond budgeting is about. Trying to move up in that right-hand corner by addressing both dimensions in a consistent way. And as Anders was showing, a number of companies on this journey. We've heard about Handelsbanken. I could have talked for hours about all the great examples here. Let me just pull up a recent example. This is a Norwegian IT company called Miles. And of course, they have no budgets, but also they have no hard targets at all. Their only target is to earn more money than the competition. Their main process is recruitment. They say if we get the recruitment right, the rest follows. They are extremely people-focused. And in that company, I mean, their employees can buy whatever PC they want. They can take any training they want, spend a month in the US if they want. The only thing the company requires is that they post the cost of what they are doing on the internet. Costs are not exploding in that company. They are earning money in buckets. Very fascinating. I won't spend time on the beyond budgeting principles, beyond again highlighting the need for coherence between the leadership side and the management process side. And let me illustrate that with a few examples of the opposite that we very often find in organizations. Lack of coherence. Because it doesn't help that we on this side talk loud and warm about how fantastic people we have on board, and we would be nothing without you, and we trust you so much, but not that much. Of course, we need to manage you through detailed travel budgets. If not, we know what will happen, right? One message here, another message here. Guess which one is strongest? Another example, it doesn't help that we on this side talk equally loud and warm about we and us and together and team. If everything we do on the incentive side, Principle 8 is around individual incentives, right? One message on the left-hand side, another on the right-hand side. Those gaps between what we say and do are poison in organizations. Now, when we started out in Statoil 2005, we were a bit careful showing these principles because we were a bit afraid of scaring people. And this is big stuff, right? And some managers get scared, and we don't want to scare people because then you risk not getting started. So we started out in a slightly different place, more logical, more related to the budget, less scary, but a great way to get started so that you later can get into many of these discussions. And it has to do with asking a very simple question that we don't ask enough, the question of why. And that question was posed to the budget. Why do we budget? What's the purpose of a budget in an organization, the set of numbers we make? And I would like to post that number to you guys as well. Why do companies make budgets? What's the purpose of those numbers? Anyway, there must be some very good reasons because most companies out there still make budgets. They want to, yes, they want to predict, which is one purpose. They want to kind of understand what the future might look like in terms of cash flows and financial capacity. And they also want to control, yes. So you use the budget as a resource allocation mechanism, handing out bags of money, right, to the organization and make sure that nobody spends more. So that's two purposes. A forecast of what the future might look like, and on the cost side, resource allocation to manage cost. I'm after one additional purpose. Targets, absolutely. We use the budget to set financial targets or production targets or whatever. Now, here we have three different purposes, and one by one, they do not necessarily represent the problem as long as they are done in the right way. The problem comes when we combine these three things in one process, resulting in one set of numbers. Because we all know what happens. If prediction is important for us, we want to understand the future, financial capacity, cash flows. We ask our salespeople, what's your best sales forecast for next year? But everybody knows that this is not just a forecasting process. That number that I now give, that will come back to me as a sales target. And there's a sales bonus linked to hitting that sales target. We all know what might happen to that sales forecast. It might start to shrink, right? I wouldn't blame the sales guy thinking like that. I would blame our management model putting this guy in a difficult position. Moving to the cost side, asking the same people, other people, what is your best cost forecast or investment forecast for next year? But everybody knows that that number will also become my budget for next year. And this is my only access to resources for next year, and whatever number I'm coming up with, somebody's going to cut this with 30%. What might happen to that potentially good cost forecast that we were just about to get? Right? Yeah, we know the game. And we tend to laugh a bit. But I think this is actually quite a serious problem. Not just because it destroys the quality of our numbers, maybe even more because this is a process that stimulates a behavior that is on the borderline of unethical. The gaming, the lowballing, the internal negotiations, that is not the kind of behaviors we would like to see in our organizations. At least not in Statoil, I can promise you. Fortunately, there's a very simple solution. We still do all this stuff, but in three different processes, because these are different things. It can be different numbers done at different times. A target is what we want to happen. A forecast is what we think will happen, whether we like what we see or not. Brutally honest, expected outcome. And resource allocation is about finding better ways of managing cost than the outdated technology of sitting in the autumn and deciding everything in detail to the last penny. Again, a technology invented 100 years ago, probably worked well 100 years ago, maybe 50 years ago, not anymore with all that VUCA and with these people on board. And once you have separated, you can start on these great improvement decisions within each of these processes. How can we set targets that are robust against the VUCA and that really inspires and motivates people? How can we have a lean, simple forecasting process where we quickly get on the table a set of unbiased numbers that we know we can trust? Doesn't have to be a million details, but we know we can trust the numbers because we have removed the reasons for gaming these numbers. And last but not least, how can we find alternatives for managing costs that are more intelligent, more effective than that detailed pre-allocation in the autumn the year before? And how can we do all of this on a more event-driven rhythm instead of everything circulating around the calendar? Let me give you a few examples of what this might, how this might work in practice. And I won't spend much time on this because you will see that this is basically stealing what Handelsbanken did. These are our two main financial KPIs. They certainly have their weaknesses. That's not the point here. But the point is that we are thinking in relative terms. These are our competitors, and the definition of performance is to do well against these guys. These two metrics, like in Handelsbanken, drives the common bonus scheme we have in Statoil. Again, we've stolen that from Handelsbanken with pride. Most of our relative KPIs are internal, not external, comparing internal units where it makes sense to compare. You can't do that all places, but when it makes sense, it is a very simple way of combining two important things. Driving performance in a very gentle, subtle way. Nobody likes to be laggards. But more importantly, stimulate learning, right? Get the guys down there to call the guys up there and find out what are you guys doing. The original purpose of benchmarking, stimulating learning. Two slides on what our managers struggle the most with, and that is to manage cost without a traditional budget. And in order to do that, it starts with culture mindset, a cost-conscious mindset, meaning asking different questions. The main question should not be, when you should do something, do I have a budget for this? If I have, it's okay. If not, it's not okay. By the way, when I'm talking budgets here, I'm talking about the annual budgets, the detailed annual budgets. I'm not necessarily talking about project budgets. We do have project budgets. They make less damage than the other type of budgets. I'm not saying that they are without damage, but they make less damage. So we want to hear more of these kind of questions on the right-hand side. Is this really necessary? Was it good enough? How is this creating value? Is this within my execution framework? Now, these are questions we should ask all the time for every penny we spend. And not just towards the end of the year when we can see the bottom of the budget bag and suddenly, hey guys, we have to be cost conscious because there's almost no money left on the budget. One reflection on this line, by the way, if you operate like this in your organization with those budget lines drawn, this is how much you can spend and not more. It works, by all means, it works. But that is just half the story. It does keep down the cost, but those budgets are also spent, right? So that ceiling is just as effective as a floor. And there is a very good reason for that, because it's rational management behavior to spend your budget. You shouldn't overspend because then you are beaten up, but don't underspend either because then you are beaten up a little bit. Why did you ask for more money than you really needed? And of course you risk getting less next year. So rational management behavior, spend your budget, not more, not less. And what that happens across the board, everybody hit their budgets. What is finance saying at the end of the year when they can see that we are coming in on budget across the board? What is finance saying? Well done, right? Great control. We have fantastic control in this company. Well, that's another example of an illusion of control, because the only thing we know was, yes, we hit those budgets, but that is no guarantee that this was the optimal use of resources. Maybe some should have spent more, maybe some should have spent less. This mindset is necessary but not sufficient. We do need something more. We have something more. The more falls in two categories: managing distinct projects and managing more operating costs. Let me start with the projects. It's a very simple concept. The bank is open 12 months a year. You can always forward a project for approval, right? But cost is important. We shall be just as good in saying no as yes. And when we say no, when we say yes, then we are making decisions, right? And what do we need in order to make good decisions? Good information. And at which point in time do we have the best information? Not just about the project we shall have a view on, yes or no, but also our capacity. Do we have the money to do this? Do we have the people to do this? Would that be in the autumn the year before, or would it be as close as possible to project startup? That was another leading question. Yeah. Right? I hope we agree that the later we can make decisions giving lead times, the better decisions we can make. So again, bank is open 12 months a year. When it comes to other costs, it is somewhat more challenging, definitely. We have a menu that is trying to help us here. On that menu, we are trying to leave the detailed annual budget, bag of money, 1,003.4, a lot of smaller bags inside, salary, overtime, consultants, travel, all these cost accounts, and very often divided into 12 monthly. A lot of mental baggaging going on in a budget process. This is a problem for the reasons I've talked about. This is an alternative. You could call that a frame or a burn rate guiding, a kind of guiding on what kind of activity level should you operate on until something else is decided. This is, in a way, you could look upon this as making sure that people are not completely in the dark. This doesn't have to be an annual amount. And by the way, it says in the range of 1,000. It doesn't say 1,003.4. And it doesn't have to be an annual number. This could be a 12-month average. It could stand until something else is decided. And within that, there's a lot of freedom to do what you, to be flexible and optimize. But sometimes this is not the right answer. Then we might move to what we call relative KPIs. And a relative in the first round here means thinking unit cost. Right? We spend a lot of money on exploring for oil and gas in Statoil. We around $3.5 billion a year. The main targets they have are unit cost target. It could, for instance, be not more than $5 per barrel. Right? If they then spend more, well, that might be okay. Well, it is okay as long as we have the financial capacity. If they find less, we expect them to spend less. So a more self-regulating mechanism, unit cost target instead of an absolute target. We might make this even more relative. We might say that, no, your target is not $5 per barrel. Your target is to be competitive. So better than the average or in first quartile or wherever, even more self-regulating. So if we end up spending $6 per barrel, is that good or bad? Well, it depends. If the other guys are spending 7 or 8, I would say 6 is pretty good. If it's the other way around, it is not very good. So achieving two things, both a more dynamic allocation of resources, but also a more intelligent language for addressing performance. If you have a true profit center, that is a way of managing cost. You cannot run away and spend money like a drunken sailor, unless what you spend is good cost, as Anders was talking about. And of course, Handelsbanken is lucky. I envy Handelsbanken because they have so many natural profit centers through all the branches. We don't have that in Statoil. I wish sometimes we had it because this part would be so much easier. Last but not least, is an alternative of nothing at all. From time to time, this is where we are as a corporate staff, the corporate staff I'm based in. No budget, no target, just monitor actual cost, discussing cost all the time. If we shall make a big decision, we have a talk with our CFO. It might be a yes, might be a no. And again, it was much easier in the old days when we got this detailed bag of money. Now here, the monkey is back on the shoulders where it should be, right? And cost does not explode. Right now, the entire oil industry is in a phase of consolidation and reducing activity levels because it becomes more, all the new research we are looking for are found in more remote, more deeper, more colder places. And so cost is a big issue and we need to reduce activity levels. So we are using more of this now compared to before in combination with these other things. The important thing is not that we are here as long as we don't fall back into this one. So this is a menu that you must use actively depending on what kind of challenges you had. For many years, we mainly operated here. Let me then finish off with talking a bit about ambition to action, the process where we are kind of tying this together, our management process. 3 purposes: translate strategy, secure this flexibility, and last but not least, activate the words in this book about people and values and leadership. Because if nice words are left like nice words, they are worth nothing. Ambition to action is actually originally based on the balanced scorecard concept. So here you will see that our model is very different from Handelsbanken's because we had different starting points. Statoil introduced balanced scorecards already in the late 90s. So we had that in place when we decided to abolish budgeting in 2005. And let me say it already now, I have a very ambivalent view on balanced scorecards. Because on one hand, if you like traditional management, centralized command and control and all that stuff at corporate level, It can be a wonderful tool to achieve exactly that. You have all this big menu of KPIs and so on that you can use to instruct and control and micromanage. And unfortunately, that is the case in many organizations. We also have people in Statoil that would like to use and try to use ambition to action like that, but we are trying to use this in a different way, and I will try to get that across in the rest of my session here. Translating strategy, it flows like this, and you might have something similar in your organization, but the way we do this might be different. Strategy here, trying to translate strategy into more concrete strategic objectives. What does success look like on a medium-term time horizon? Then we are trying to find KPIs that can measure that we are moving towards these objectives. The only problem with measurement is that measurement alone moves nothing. Nothing happens just because we measure. You don't lose weight simply by weighing yourself, which I've tried, by the way. And it didn't work. And when it didn't work, then my wife, she told me that, Bjarte, maybe you didn't stand there long enough. And that might be the case, and that would be some kind of action, but it's not those kind of actions we are after. But we know that nothing happens before we do something, and we also try to understand the consequences of what we do through forecasts. Finally, there's a translation of all of this into, well, what does this mean for you and me and the teams we are based in? And here we are straight into the HR process, moving from strategy via finance into HR. And here's an example of activating values. The first words in the Statoil book, the very first words, are the following. At Statoil, the way we deliver is as important as what we deliver. And when we talk about the way we deliver, we talk about the values in this book and behavior. And this decision came from our CEO. And to make sure that everybody understood that he was serious about this, he put the weighting between the two, the what and the how, in all consequences for your career, base pay, individual bonus if you're on that system. He put that weighting to 50-50. Now, you might say that that was a brave decision because not too many companies have done that. Some have, but not too many. But on the other hand, it was an obvious decision because how can we say that we are trying to be a values-based organization if everything around values is completely absent in setting priorities and goals and evaluating and consequences? That would have been a very big gap between what we said and what we did. By all means, it's difficult to set good behavior goals. It's difficult to evaluate. But again, our guiding star cannot be to go for what's easy. Right? We have to go for the stuff that's good for performance. This, I mentioned that this is partly based on the balance scorecard process, and some additional potential bad news around that is that all our competitors, they also use balance scorecards in some form or shape. So if we want to get competitive advantage, we need to do this in a different and better way. So I want to share with you now towards the end a few areas where we try to be distinctly different. The big difference, combining beyond budgeting balance scorecards, makes a big difference. But let me be a bit more specific. One difference, KPIs. Looking at many of our competitors, their scorecard is mainly about KPIs. Very little on the left-hand side, very little on the right-hand side. And that is a problem because of the I in KPI, which stands for indicator. And why is that a problem? It is a problem to kind of base your entire management on these indicators because they are indicators. They are not necessarily telling the full truth, right? So it is a very narrow mechanical way of talking about performance. And the KPIs, they need help in this job we give them of being a place where we express targets and we shall measure that we are moving towards these targets. We need something on the left-hand side and on the right-hand side to create a broader, richer performance language. And we also need what we call a holistic performance evaluation. When we evaluate performance, we need to take off the measurement glasses and look at the stuff that measurement and KPIs did not pick up before we conclude. I'll come back to that. Albert Einstein, you probably know his quote, "Not everything that counts can be counted. Not everything that can be counted counts." Highly relevant here. Measurement can be a good servant. As a master, it can be a disaster. Let me share with you an example of an ambition to action just to make this a little bit more concrete. This is actually a screenshot from the system where we keep this, and this is actually a Statoil ambition to action. If you're familiar with the balance scorecard, you will recognize that we have these different perspectives. Down here, we express what we are trying to achieve. These are the two relative KPIs I showed earlier. And everything above is the stuff we need to be good at in order to make that happen. HSE, by the way, health, safety in the environment, extremely important in our business. Today we have around 1,400 of these in the organization, and let me use this slide to illustrate a few other areas where we try to be different. The first has to do with creating alignment, getting this to hang reasonably well together. There is an easy way of doing it. It's called cascading. If you read a balanced scorecards book, they talk over and over again about cascading, sitting at corporate level and instructing all the way down the content here. And when that happens, numbers are cascaded down, and finance can then afterwards add everything together. All targets can be added together, and it matches the corporate number. Then finance will say that, yes, we're going to hit this corporate target because all the local targets kind of matches the corporate one. Another illusion of control, because if that cascading has destroyed everything around involvement, commitment, motivation, if your own ambition to action only becomes a landing ground for instruction from above, then you lose all those good things that you need. And we do have managers and people in Statoil who would like to use ambition to action in that way, and we are fighting it every day. Because we want, and one approach we've taken here is to say that it is not mandatory to have an ambition to action. That is something that teams choose for themselves. And that means that a lot of teams, they ask us, well, should we have an ambition to action in our team? And we would say that we think this can be pretty good, but your main motivation for having an ambition to action in your team should be that this is something that you and your team perceive as a meaningful, value-adding, sensible thing to do in order for you to manage yourself. That should be the main motivation, and not that this is imposed from above and it's just another part of the big control system. At the same time, we need the alignment. This can't be anarchy. There is an alternative way to achieve that. We call it translation instead of cascading. And translation means that when this team shall make an ambition to action, they would look at other relevant ambition to actions. One above, maybe a bit further up, maybe all the way up, a bit left and right if they have relations this way. And that team needs a big, long discussion about what does our ambition to action need to look like in order to reflect direction and ambition levels of those that we have a relation to. If such a translation should go wrong, which is almost a non-issue, then of course the level above should intervene and do what they are paid for, but it's not a problem. One reason maybe for this not being a problem is transparency. All of these ambition to actions is open for everybody. There is some information that we need to close because it's share sensitive. On top of that, unfortunately, I see some managers closing additional information, but the principle is open for everybody. That creates a control mechanism. It's harder to kind of hide away with a stupid ambition to action if everybody can see it. The other reason we need transparency is that how can you translate unless there is transparency? Translation does not mean that we never instruct from above. There are situations when that is the right thing to do, but it should be more the exception than the rule, and then it's also more accepted when it happens. Last issue around this one before we move towards the end has to do with time. We used to have annual versions of ambition to action. Not anymore. So every year we made a new one in the autumn, not anymore. Now, all these teams can change whatever they want on their own ambition to action when there is a need for it. Typically, that doesn't mean changing all of it. It means adjusting parts and so on. You can change strategic objectives if strategy change. You can change KPIs if these objectives change, or if you simply find better KPIs. You can even change these KPI targets if they have lost their meaning. And lost their meaning can mean two things. Either this target is impossible to achieve. Everybody laughs about it. Right? Those targets, they don't work. They don't inspire, they don't motivate. They have only one purpose left. That's punishment. And that's not that motivating. Or it could be the other way around, that this target is a piece of cake. The only control mechanism we have put around this is to say that if you want to change something that's big, you still need to seek approval one level up. But you can do that at any time. If you want to change something that's big, that's small, you only inform the level above. Big or small, make sure that you inform those affected next to you. So this is the coordination part of it. And then we have left it to the organization to decide for themselves what is big and what is small. Because when we introduced this, some said that, well, this is nice, but you have to tell us, make a corporate instruction about what is big and what is small for all these teams. Impossible. So we didn't do that. It's decided more locally. And that means that if someone over here might end up with a different definition of big and small than somebody over here. And that is okay as long as this works in both places. So back to self-regulation and the traffic metaphor, we would like to make this process as self-regulating as possible. Is this difficult? Yes. For some people, the calendar year is hardwired. So even if we have a load for this, some people continue to work in annual cycles. In some areas, you are forced to it by kind of external actors. But we are kind of slowly seeing that people are starting to use more and more of this opportunity. Targets and forecasts, horizons, time horizons and time. We want targets to have natural time horizons. Why should all targets have a deadline of end of December? Is that just because of the link to pay? And is that a good enough reason? No, it isn't. So targets should have natural time horizons. Some short if there is urgency, and it's possible to deliver in 3 months. Some targets might be longer if it's more complex and you need more time. We haven't banned, end of December targets. That might make sense in some places, but we're trying to get people to set natural target horizons. That does not mean that we can't sit down, like we still do, once a year and talk about and discuss and evaluate performance in performance dialogues. We still have an annual cycle on that, although we have started that discussion as well. But then you can, in those discussions, some would look back on an ambition to action that's been quite dynamic. Other areas, nothing much has happened. So there's no problem combining dynamic and this fixed rhythm on evaluation. And by the way, dynamic here does not necessarily mean more often. It means at the right time. A lot of people think it's kind of always more often. It means at the right time. Last but not least, forecasting for the finance people in the room. You will be familiar with rolling forecasting, which is much better than traditional forecasting, typically updating your forecast every quarter, looking 5 quarters ahead. We chose not to do that because we were about to do it, but then we realized that there is quite a lot of variety in the business rhythms across the board here. So why should we force everybody into a forecasting rhythm with the same frequency, same time horizon for everybody? So we instead introduced what we call dynamic forecasting. So here, teams update their forecast when stuff happens and update as far as relevant in their business reality. If that is too short for somebody up there, we ask the guys up there to fill generically that hole instead of forcing everybody to, with kind of accounting precision, to do it from bottom up. Let me finish with a holistic performance evaluation. I've touched upon that a few times. And holistic means 2 things. First of all, not just looking at business delivery, what, but also at behaviors, how, defined by our values, counting 50-50. But holistic also means when we assess ambition to action and delivery, it's not just a question of looking at those KPIs and then concluding red or green. Because if that is what performance evaluation is about, just reading the colors of these KPIs, then the only qualification you need as a manager to do that job at least is that you are not color blind. And I think we should have somewhat higher requirements to our managers. So we do measure, and we do, but then we take off the measurement glasses, and then we pressure test measurement through some very simple questions before we conclude. Have you really moved towards those objectives? How ambitious were those targets? Should we punish teams who stretched and didn't make it compared to those who lowballed and gamed and made it? Very often, those things are more visible afterwards than before. Has there been significant changes in assumptions, tailwind, headwind of such a nature that should be taken into account? Shouldn't take everything into account, but big issues should be taken into account both ways. And it's only when we have concluded these questions that we can have a view on performance. Here there was a 3 on delivery, a 4 on behavior, and that outcome or rating is the basis for development plans for all employees and also rewards, meaning base salary adjustments for everybody outside the regulated area, and individual bonuses for those on individual bonus. So we do have individual bonuses in Statoil, quite modest compared to our competitors, but I think the important thing is that we have this holistic evaluation in between. So it's not a straight mathematical line between this is your KPI performance and this is your bonus. Very, very dangerous. So to close off, going back to the metaphor, I hope you've seen that the stuff that we are trying to do is very much about trying to move the sentiment of how we manage towards this way of managing into something more self-regulating, whether it comes to cost or rhythm or translation or thinking relative KPIs or transparency. This is an attempt to simplify, But the simplification, if you think back to the management process dimension, the leadership dimension, the simplification is very much in the management process side. On the leadership side, I mean, this is, a lot of leaders would perceive this as more challenging and the old model as more simple. But again, our guiding star cannot be to go for the stuff that's simple because it's simple. We have to go for the stuff that's good for performance. And on the leadership side, that is sometimes a bit more difficult. So let me close here. I don't need to make a commercial for the roundtable here, but then if anybody wants to follow me on Twitter, that's highly appreciated. I only tweet about beyond budgeting. And as Anders was alluding to earlier, this is the short version, and the long version is in this book which I wrote, not just about Statoil, but also what we did in Borealis back in 1995.
How do you start an organization transitioning to this?
It's a highly relevant and good question, and I mean, well, you know, going back to my introduction, I mean, most small companies, they are born beyond budgeting. They become something else as they grow. And our case was that we had become something else by growing and adopting a lot of traditional management processes. So how do you, and it's much harder to kind of change that than to start out and kind of stick to yeah. Can you recall when we started out in Statoil? I said the 12 beyond budgeting principles, a bit big, a bit scary. So we didn't start out there in the beginning. We started with this separation of the budget purposes. So saying that here are these 3 different purposes. We want to separate it because there are some problems with combining this. And that doesn't scare anyone. It's pure logic, right? So, but once you have separated, once you move into those improvement discussions, then very often you indirectly come into these bigger issues of how can we set targets that are robust against the dynamic world? What kind of resource allocation mechanism do we need if we say in our values that we really trust people? So we've seen it over and over again that you're coming into these bigger issues in a less scary way. So, I mean, I've been in companies and seen CEOs who have understood all of this and wanted this from day one. It's a wonderful situation to be in. There was a Norwegian bank, for instance, that was in that situation. But that will unfortunately so far be more the exception than the rule. Then, if that's not the case, I recommend we'll start with separating these 3 purposes: target setting, forecasting, resource allocation, and try to move on with good discussions about how that can be done, taking reality seriously. And very often you'll find yourself started. Of course, the little bit dangerous thing with that is that some are getting stuck at this point. They introduce some rolling forecasts, and maybe yes, we separate targets, but everything around targets is just like before, and resource allocation more or less like before. And then they think they've gone beyond budgeting. So that's, of course, the risk. And I've also seen companies starting out only doing, well, they said, we want to do beyond budgeting, and isn't that about rolling forecasts? So we're going to do rolling forecasts. That's a great thing. Then they do that without a thought about, well, how will we then do resource allocation and target setting? Well, they have thought about it. Of course, we will do it in the rolling forecast process. And if they do that, the only thing they have done is to implement rolling budgets, right? 4 times a year. They have solved so much of the budget problems. So that's the danger of kind of getting stuck in the separation and not moving into the improvement phase. But that is one way of getting started. In general, beyond that, I always recommend people considering this journey to spend quality time up front discussing together what kind of problems are we trying to solve. Right? Because nobody's happy, but what people are unhappy about might kind of vary. So unless you align the kind of case for change, your implementation will be messy. And beyond that, very often this starts on the finance side for maybe some obvious reasons, but the more finance can join forces with HR, the better, right? The stronger you become. In the bank I talked about, this started out in finance. They now moved the responsibility for coordinating this to HR, because they've seen that the issues are not around relative KPIs and rolling forecasts. That's not the challenge. It's all about people and culture. Finally, don't design to 100%. I mean, design to 80% on these new processes, and then you jump. And then you sort out the rest afterwards. We've seen it over and over again that, I mean, yes, there will be issues that you hadn't thought about and so on. So start out, experiment a bit, and get started instead of planning too much. Yeah. And talk to other companies. Join the Bjarte. Read my book. And the other great books.
You said you have the 1,400 ambition to action plans at Statoil, and I wanted maybe to get further into the alignment process, because there has to be some consistency in all of those plans. So either it comes from the top, that's what you call cascade, and that's what you don't do at Statoil. Instead, you mentioned translation, but given there is no starting point and everyone is making up their own targets, ambitions, it can go into very different directions, and there is no wrong directions. In the first place, there was no general direction. So how does the translation process work, and how do you end up with some consistency in all those actions?
Yeah. I think what you're after is kind of reasonable consistency, but not kind of mathematical alignment. And one mechanism is transparency, simply that you make it open so that people can see. But this is quite organic. We've just had an example now, because as I mentioned, there's been a big reorientation in the oil business from volume and growth into value and also more cost focus, which I think is good, because we've been too volume and growth driven. And that kind of, call it a strategic reorientation, has kind of siphoned through these ambition to actions in a very unorganic way. None of us at corporate has kind of been sitting on top and checking all the way down that these objectives now are changed and so on. But I surf a lot around in ambition to action, looking at different ambition to actions. And I can see the focus shifting. I can see revised strategic objectives. I can see different KPIs. I can see different actions, reflecting these messages from the top about, yes, we need to change the focus here. So, and of course, nobody has 1,400 it's a big number, but nobody has a relationship to all 1,400. You have a relationship to your own, to the one above, maybe a few above, further up, some left and right. And of course, if you have teams reporting to you, you have a relationship to those. So in a way, it becomes self-regulating, because if everybody makes sure that the ones around me are kind of reasonably aligned, and if that happens at all levels, it kind of falls in place in a good enough way. Is there mathematical consistency? No. Does it sufficiently point in the same direction? Yes.
Bjarte, a bit of a challenge. In the media in Norway, we read a lot about the focus in Statoil right now, described as from a media perspective, as a harsh cost-cutting program for the organization. How does that match both with the long-term perspectives in Statoil of your people, and also with what might seem to be, for me, as a conflict with one of the most important principles in beyond budgeting? Just your reflections upon that challenge?
No, it's a good question, and what the media write is partly true, partly wrong. It's wrong when it comes to, I mean, we're hammered because people are saying that we are kind of reducing significantly our investment levels, which is not true. We are investing around $20 billion a year. That's where we will end up this year. We've never invested that much more money. But it is true that we had forecasts not that long ago that showed us that if we didn't do anything, we were heading towards a much higher level, and we knew that this is not sustainable. We don't have the money, we don't have the people to do this, and so on. So compared to that, yes, we are call it reducing from that level. But anything else would have been irresponsible. In addition to that, we are also reducing some other costs. It is coming through benchmarking. We are doing a lot of benchmarking. We did some years ago benchmarking around support services and through Hackett, if you know that organization. And the conclusion was that we are, quality-wise, we were doing great. Cost-wise, we were quite expensive compared to some competitors. One reason was that we have decided to keep most of our employees in Norway and Scandinavia, or in other kind of high cost places, not doing that much outsourcing. So we have done somewhat more outsourcing now, and we are also reducing some cost. But it can't be so that, I mean, if beyond budgeting never kind of allowed for reducing activities, reducing cost, it would not be a sustainable model. If you think back to the menu I was showing about different ways of managing cost, that option to the left is what then kicks in, and the starter book says a little bit about it, which I wanted to share with you. Cost targets are established if and when necessary. These are primarily set using relative targets. Absolute cost targets may be set if a significant change in activity and cost level is required. But these must be set at the overall rather than the detail level to secure the necessary flexibility. So I think the issue for us is less do we have more of those in the range of 1,000 KPIs. That is not the main issue. The main issue is how do we avoid kind of falling even further to the left, that those are converted into something that might look like detailed budgets. So, but it's a relevant question, and of course there are people that say that why couldn't we just go back to traditional budgeting? That will make all of this so much easier. And I agree, it would have been easier, but I don't think it would be better.